All right, so you sent over this pretty interesting stack of reports about crime prevention and
Yeah.
cybersecurity, and I gotta say, at first glance,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't really seeing the connection, but
Yeah.
the more I dug into it, the
Yeah.
more fascinated I got.
It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, there's some really interesting connections here, so I'm excited to dive into it with you and see what we can uncover.
Sounds good.
So we're going to start with something that just kind of makes you scratch your head.
Okay.
Back in the 1940s, there was this program, the Cambridge-Somerville Youth Study.
Mm-hmm.
They were trying to help these at-risk youth in Boston,
Right.
providing them with tutoring, counseling, all sorts of support.
Yeah, seemed like a good idea.
Yeah, you'd think that would help set them on the right path, right?
Definitely.
But the follow-up was pretty shocking.
Yeah, the participants were actually more likely to commit crimes than the kids who didn't get the extra help.
Wow.
And not just crime, there were higher rates of F problems and mental illness, too.
So it's like the program actually made things worse.
Yeah, it's a classic example of good intentions backfiring.
Yeah, and it really highlights that no matter what system you're looking at, there are always these unintended consequences.
Yeah, and that's where this work by Grabosky comes in.
Yeah.
He identifies 10 ways that crime prevention efforts can backfire.
So more harm than good.
Exactly.
So what are some examples of that? What did he call it?
Counterproductive crime prevention.
Counterproductive crime prevention.
Yeah, so one type is escalation. Imagine a police chase after someone for like a really minor traffic violation.
Okay.
The chase itself can make the situation worse, right? Leading to even more dangerous driving and accidents and potentially even injuries.
Oh, so it's like instead of solving the problem,
Yeah,
the response actually makes it worse.
exactly.
Got it. Okay, so what else?
Another type is displacement. Say you implement all these security measures to prevent car theft in a neighborhood. Well, the thieves probably won't just stop stealing cars. They might just move to a different neighborhood or start targeting different types of vehicles.
Right, so you're not really solving the problem, you're just
Right.
shifting it around.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's over-deterrence, where really strict rules can have negative side effects.
Okay.
Grabosky uses the example of building codes.
Okay.
They're meant to keep people safe, but if they're too strict, landlords might abandon affordable housing rather than pay for all the upgrades.
Right.
And that could actually worsen homelessness.
Wow. So even with good intentions, you can end up creating more problems.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
Absolutely. So are there other examples of these counterproductive effects?
Yeah, sometimes even programs that sound really good can have unintended consequences.
Like what?
Like Toys for Guns programs.
Okay.
The goal is to get guns off the streets, right?
Right.
But some argue that they might actually stimulate demand for cheap firearms.
Oh, so it's like the program itself could actually be contributing to the problem it's trying to solve.
Potentially.
That's pretty fascinating and a little scary.
Definitely.
Okay, so what about this idea of moral hazard?
Oh, yeah. So moral hazard is basically when people take more risks because they know they're protected in some way.
Okay.
A good example is people with theft insurance.
Mm-hmm.
They might be less careful about security because they figure they'll just get reimbursed if something gets stolen.
Oh, so there's less incentive to be cautious.
Right.
I see. So how does all of this relate to our everyday lives? I mean, most of us aren't designing crime prevention programs.
Well, think about it this way. Have you ever seen a rule or a policy backfire?
Yeah, definitely.
Like maybe a zero tolerance rule at school or work that ended up punishing people unfairly?
Oh, yeah. Or like when I try to solve one problem and end up creating a whole bunch of new ones.
Exactly. Grabosky's work helps us understand that our actions can have unforeseen consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about how good intentions can have unexpected outcomes in the real world,
Right.
but how does this connect to the digital world and cybersecurity?
Well, that's where this DC3 Advanced Carver report comes in.
Right.
It analyzes a tool that's used in digital forensics.
So like digital detective work.
Yeah, basically a way to recover deleted files.
So like digging through the digital trash to find clues.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. It's called file carving, and it's like piecing together a digital jigsaw puzzle.
Okay,
You take these fragments of data and try to reconstruct the deleted files.
got it. So what kind of files are we talking about here?
Well, the report goes into detail about recovering fragmented JPGs.
Okay.
They were able to recover like Stonehenge.jpg was about 50% recovered,
Okay.
Grizzly.jpg at 84%, Dino.jpg almost 95%.
Okay, but why should we care about a bunch of dinosaur pictures?
It's not about the specific pictures, it's about what this technology represents.
Okay.
Think back to what we discussed about Grabosky's work.
Right, the unintended consequences.
Exactly.
Right.
Imagine this DC3 Advanced Carver falling into the wrong hands.
Oh, so a tool designed for good
Yeah.
could be used for bad.
Precisely.
Okay, so what could someone do with that?
They could reconstruct sensitive information that was supposed to be deleted.
So, like, what kind of information?
Financial records, private photos, confidential documents.
Wow, that's a little scary.
It is. Anything that was thought to be gone could be pieced back together.
Yeah, it seems like with technology, there's always this potential for misuse.
There is. It's a constant balancing act, making sure these tools are effective for law enforcement, but also preventing them from being used for harmful purposes.
It's like a cat and mouse game, isn't it? As soon as we come up with new security measures, someone finds a way to exploit them.
It really is.
So it's not just about building a stronger lock, it's about understanding the mindset of the lock pickers, right?
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us to another interesting tool that was mentioned, the CARVER+Shock Vulnerability Assessment Framework.
Okay, so tell me about that.
So this framework, it was originally developed by the military
Okay,
to identify weaknesses in infrastructure,
okay.
but it's being used now to assess vulnerabilities in a much wider range of areas like food supply chains.
Wow, so it's like a universal risk assessment tool.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does it work?
Well, the acronym itself helps break down the key factors. CARVER stands for criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, and recognizability.
Okay, and what about the plus shock?
Oh, right. The plus shock element was added later to consider the psychological impact of an attack.
Got it. Okay, so let's go through those one by one. What's criticality?
So criticality is basically how important the target is.
Okay,
Like a power plant would have a much higher criticality rating than, say, a grocery store.
right, that makes sense. Okay, what about accessibility?
Accessibility is how easy it is to reach the target.
So something that's in a remote area would be less accessible?
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
And then recuperability is about how quickly a target can be restored after an attack.
Okay, so a system with good backups would have a higher recuperability rating.
Right.
Okay, so vulnerability seems pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
It's about how susceptible the target is to attack, right?
Right. That could be because of its physical security measures or cybersecurity defenses or even the presence of insider threats.
Right, right. Okay, so effect is about the impact of a successful attack, I assume.
Yeah, so that could be casualties, economic damage, disruption of services, depending on what the target is.
Got it. Okay, what about recognizability?
Recognizability is how easily the target can be identified. A landmark building would have a higher recognizability than a random warehouse, for example.
Okay, that makes sense. And finally, we have shock.
Right, so shock assesses the psychological impact of an attack. It considers the fear and disruption an attack could cause, even beyond any physical damage.
So it's about the lasting impact.
Yeah, like think about the 9/11 attacks.
Right,
The shock went far beyond the physical destruction of the buildings.
definitely.
So this CARVER+Shock framework, it's about taking a comprehensive view of risk, considering not just the physical and technical aspects, but also the human and psychological factors.
So it's not just about building stronger systems, it's about understanding the human element.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this connects.
Good.
So we've talked about external threats, like criminals and cyber attacks.
Mm-hmm.
But this next document, this high consequence events prevention framework,
Yeah.
it shifts the focus to internal factors, right?
Right. Specifically, the role of organizational culture in preventing those really big catastrophic failures.
So again, it's about the human element, not just the technology or systems in place.
Exactly. It emphasizes the need for a risk-aware culture where everyone in the organization is involved in identifying and mitigating risks.
Okay, so what does a risk-aware culture look like in practice?
Well, first you need leaders who actively promote safe behaviors and set the tone from the top.
Okay.
And then supervisors need to be trained to apply these risk-aware tools.
Mm-hmm.
And really importantly, everyone from the CEO to the newest hire, they all need to believe that these events are preventable.
So it's not just about having policies, but about empowering people to speak up if they see something wrong.
Exactly. And the document actually uses some compelling examples to illustrate this point. For example, the B-2 Spirit crash in Guam back in 2008.
Okay.
It was a really tragic example of how technical and human errors can combine to lead to disaster.
So even in highly complex systems, human error can still be a major factor.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what other examples do they use?
Well, there's the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
Reflexive obedience played a big role in that crisis. That's where people just blindly follow orders even when they know something's wrong.
Right, so it's about the importance of questioning authority even when it's uncomfortable. Okay, that makes sense. And was there another example?
Yeah, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010.
Okay.
Ignoring expert advice and focusing on deadlines instead of safety.
Oh, wow.
That led to a catastrophic failure.
So in that case, it was a combination of ignoring warnings and prioritizing the wrong things.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, so these examples really highlight how organizational culture can either make or break a system, even when you're dealing with, like, incredibly complex technology or high-stakes situations.
It really can, and it all comes back to that overarching theme we've been seeing throughout all these reports, the human factor.
Right, whether we're talking about crime prevention, cybersecurity, or preventing these large-scale disasters.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about technology or systems. It's about people and the decisions they make.
Exactly.
So developing this risk-aware mindset, that's crucial no matter what field you're in.
Absolutely.
And it's not about avoiding risk entirely. It's about understanding it, managing it, and making good decisions based on the information you have.
I agree.
Okay, so that's a lot to digest.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after hearing all of this?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that we're all vulnerable to unintended consequences,
Okay,
both in our personal lives and our work lives.
so even seemingly small decisions can have ripple effects.
Yeah, and it's not about being paranoid. It's about thinking critically and asking yourself what could go wrong.
Right, so it's about developing that healthy skepticism and being willing to challenge assumptions.
Exactly.
We can't always predict the future, but we can try to anticipate potential problems and be prepared to adapt.
Right. And we also need to remember that we're all part of larger systems, our families, workplaces, communities, and the decisions we make can impact others.
So it's about individual responsibility and collective accountability.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. So we've laid out a lot of complex ideas here,
We have.
but this is really just the beginning, right?
Oh, yeah, just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to learn about crime prevention, cybersecurity, and risk in general.
And these reports are just a starting point.
A good starting point. Staying curious and keeping learning, that's crucial in these fields, especially because things are always changing.
Okay, so before we move on, I want to leave you with something to think about. We've talked about external threats and building risk-aware cultures within organizations.
Right.
But what about the risks we pose to ourselves?
Oh, that's interesting.
What are our own blind spots that might lead us to make bad decisions?
That's a really good question. I think the most dangerous risks are often the ones we don't see coming because of our own biases.
So how do we overcome those internal blind spots?
Well, one way is to get feedback from others, especially people who might have a different perspective than us.
Okay?
And we should also be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
So be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just about being aware of the risks around us, but also the risks within us.
I like that. Self-awareness is a crucial part of risk awareness.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. Unintended consequences, digital forensics, organizational culture.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion.
I'm really eager to hear what other insights you've gleaned from these reports.
Well, there's still plenty more to unpack.
Okay, great.
We haven't even talked about all the different types of files that the DC3 Advanced Carver recovered,
Right.
or how to apply the CARVER+Shock framework to a food supply chain.
Okay.
And I think it would be really valuable to look more closely at those case studies mentioned in the High Consequence Events Prevention Framework document.
Absolutely. Those real-world examples can really bring these concepts to life.
I agree.
All right, well, I'm looking forward to that.
Me too.
Let's do it. We'll dive into those in part 2.
Sounds good. It's amazing how much we found just from looking at the surface of these reports.
Yeah, totally.
There's so much more.
Yeah, we talked about the DC3 Advanced Carver
Right.
and, like, its ability to recover those deleted JPGs.
Mm-hmm.
But the report actually tested it with a bunch of other file types, too.
Oh, yeah, they tested it with HAIC, PNG, BMP.
Oh, wow, the whole gang's here.
The whole gang.
Okay, and so how did it do?
Well, the recovery rates were different depending on the type of file and how fragmented the data was.
Makes sense.
Like, they were able to recover almost 99% of a BMP file
Okay.
called smokedchicken.bmp.
Smokedchicken.bmp, okay.
Yeah, and a full 100% of yuck.tiff.
Yuck.tiff. What was that a picture of?
I have no idea. I didn't make the test images.
Okay, fair enough.
But the point is, even with these sophisticated tools like the DC3 Advanced Carver, there's no guarantee you'll recover everything.
Right.
It all depends on the situation.
So for digital forensic investigators,
Yeah.
understanding all those little details about file carving, that's crucial.
It is.
They can't just rely on one tool.
Right, they need a whole arsenal at their disposal.
Exactly.
And, it highlights the challenges of dealing with fragmented data in our increasingly digital world.
Def-
Even if you think something's gone forever, it might still be out there, just waiting to be pieced back together.
Like a digital ghost story.
I like that.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the CARVER+Shock framework.
Okay.
How could a cyber criminal use that framework along with a tool like the DC3 Advanced Carver?
Okay, so imagine they're targeting a company's data backups.
Okay,
They could use CARVER+Shock to assess the vulnerability of those backups.
right.
So first, they would look at the criticality of the data.
Okay,
How important is this data to the company?
right.
Then they would look at accessibility. Where is the data stored? Is it online, offline, or both?
And then recuperability would be key too, right?
Yeah, how fast could the company restore the data if the backups are messed with?
Exactly.
And of course, vulnerability too. Are there any weaknesses in the backup system
Oh, right.
that they could exploit?
Got it.
So by using the CARVER+Shock framework, they could find the weakest points in the company's data backup strategy
Okay.
and then tailor their attack.
That's pretty clever,
That is.
but also kind of unsettling how, like, a tool designed for good
Yeah,
can be turned into a weapon.
that's true.
Okay, so it really underscores why organizations need to be so proactive about cybersecurity. It's not just about reacting to attacks, it's about anticipating them
Right.
and making sure you buy everything covered.
Exactly.
Speaking of being proactive, let's talk about the High Consequence Events Prevention Framework document again.
Okay.
It emphasizes a risk-aware culture in organizations, right?
Yeah, it basically provides this roadmap
Yeah.
for organizations to create a culture where everyone is working together to prevent those catastrophic failures.
Right.
And it talks about this really interesting concept of the mindful human element.
Mindful human element. I don't think we've talked about that.
No, we haven't.
Okay, so what is that?
So it's the idea that everyone in the organization is
Huh?
constantly aware of the potential for errors
Right.
and are actively trying to prevent them.
So it's not just about following the rules, it's about really understanding the risks and taking ownership of safety.
Exactly. And the document also talks about overcoming these destructive organizational habits.
Destructive organizational habits.
Yeah, so these are like ingrained patterns of behavior
Okay.
that can increase risk even if they're not obvious.
Like what? Give me an example.
One is tribal knowledge,
Okay.
where information is hoarded by just a few people
Right.
instead of being shared openly.
Okay, so not good teamwork, basically.
Yeah, and then there's groupism, where people are more loyal to their team than to the whole organization.
Oh, yeah, so you get those silos where information doesn't flow freely,
Right.
and people are afraid to challenge decisions made by their own group.
Exactly.
Okay, so that definitely sounds destructive. What else?
There's also this thing called success suffices.
Success suffices. What is that?
It's the belief that because things have gone well in the past, they'll always continue to go well.
Oh, so you just get complacent.
Yeah, and you fail to adapt to new situations.
It's like assuming that because you've never been in a car accident, you never will be.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So we need to get rid of these bad habits, but the document also talks about learning from errors and failures.
Right, because even with the best intentions, things can still go wrong.
Exactly.
The document points to those high-profile incidents we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah, like the B-2 crash, Fukushima, Deepwater Horizon,
Mm-hmm.
all those show what can happen when you don't have that risk-aware culture.
Right. In each case, there were warning signs that were either missed or ignored, and then boom, disaster.
Exactly.
So it's not just about preventing errors, it's about learning from them.
Yeah, and that requires a culture where people feel comfortable reporting errors
Right?
without being afraid of getting in trouble.
Okay, so you need that open communication.
You do.
So we've talked about external threats and internal factors, but I want to get even more specific.
Okay.
The document talks about this procurement of the UK's Type 45 destroyer.
Yeah, the Type 45.
What can we learn from that example?
Well, it's a really interesting case study because it shows how planning errors, contracting issues, and those cultural factors we just talked about
Right.
can all combine to create major problems in these complex projects.
So tell me about the Type 45 program. What was it supposed to be?
Well, it was supposed to give the Royal Navy a brand new class of these super advanced destroyers,
Okay.
but it ended up being plagued by delays and cost overruns, and they didn't even meet the basic requirements.
So it was a bit of a mess.
It was.
Okay, so what went wrong?
Well, one problem was the cost estimates during the planning phase.
Okay.
They were way too optimistic. They underestimated how complex the design was and how hard it would be to integrate the new technology.
So they promised something they couldn't deliver.
Yeah, basically, another problem was the contracts, the way they were structured.
Okay.
They used fixed price contracts
Mm-hmm.
with multiple shipbuilders, and that was supposed to control costs. But it ended up creating a huge logistical nightmare.
Oh, wow. So the attempt to streamline the process backfired?
It did.
Okay, so that's planning and contracting.
Mm-hmm.
What about the cultural factors?
Right. So the review of the program found a culture of production within the Ministry of Defense.
Culture of production.
Yeah, where meeting deadlines and staying on budget was more important than making sure the ships actually worked properly.
Oh, so it was all about checking boxes rather than focusing on the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Okay, so how did that actually play out? What were some of the specific decisions they made?
Well, they decided to reduce the number of ships
Okay.
from 8 to 6
Okay.
based on how well they thought this networked capability would perform.
Mm-hmm.
But then they ended up getting rid of that capability
To save money.
to save money, but they never went back and adjusted the number of ships they needed.
Oh, wow. So they ended up with a smaller, less capable fleet.
They did.
That's a pretty big oversight.
It was
Okay, and what about that reluctance to question authority you mentioned? How did that factor in?
Yeah, well, junior personnel were really hesitant to raise concerns,
Okay.
even when they had serious doubts.
Oh, wow. So there's a lack of open communication.
There was, and it was made worse by the rigid bureaucratic structure.
Okay. Yeah, not good.
So it was a combination of bad planning, poor communication, and a culture that didn't encourage people to speak up.
No wonder it was such a mess.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the takeaways here? What can other organizations learn from the Type 45?
Well, I think it shows that a risk-aware culture isn't just about having good policies. It's about creating an environment
Well,
where people feel safe speaking up,
Right.
challenging assumptions, raising concerns.
And knowing they won't get in trouble for it.
Exactly.
So it's about open communication and psychological safety.
Right. So how do you create that kind of culture?
Yeah, that's the big question. I mean, it sounds great, but how do you actually do it?
Well, it starts with leadership. Leaders need to be open to feedback, even if it's negative. They need to encourage people to disagree with them, and they need to acknowledge when they've made a mistake.
So basically lead by example.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they need to empower their employees to identify and report risks.
Okay, so it's about creating a system where mistakes are seen as opportunities to learn.
Right, instead of as something to be punished.
Yeah, moving from a culture of blame to a culture of learning.
I like that.
I like that too.
Okay, so we've focused a lot on organizational culture.
Yeah.
What about individuals?
Yeah, what can we do to be more risk aware in our own lives?
That's a great question.
Yeah, because it's not just about organizations, it's about us as individuals making good decisions.
It is.
Okay, so what can we do?
Well, one thing is to develop this habit of thinking critically and questioning assumptions.
Okay?
Don't just accept things at face value. Do your own research and come to your own conclusions.
Right, trust but verify.
Exactly.
Okay, so think to yourself.
Yeah.
What else?
And be aware of your own biases.
Oh, right, we all have those.
Yeah, but they can lead us to make bad decisions.
Okay, so how do we even know what our biases are? They're called blind spots for a reason.
It can be tricky, but there are a few things you can do.
Okay.
One is to get feedback from people who are different from you.
Okay.
People who have different backgrounds and experiences.
Right, different perspectives.
Exactly.
Okay, so get outside your bubble a little bit.
Yeah, and also pay attention to your own emotional reactions, like if you get defensive or dismissive.
That could be a sign that I'm not being objective.
It could.
So our emotions can actually be clues?
They can.
Okay, that's really interesting.
And one last thing, remember that risk isn't always a bad thing.
Okay.
Taking risks can be a good thing.
Okay.
They can help you grow and come up with new ideas.
Right, like no river, no reward.
Exactly.
But it's about calculated risks, right?
All right, understanding the potential consequences and making informed decisions.
So managing the risk effectively.
Yeah.
And even if it doesn't work out the way you hoped, you can still learn from it.
Absolutely. Failure is just part of the process.
Okay, so we've talked about crime, disasters, cyber attacks, all this heavy stuff.
We have.
But I want to lighten things up for a second.
Okay.
All this talk about risk has got me thinking about those times when a decision backfires in like a funny way.
Oh, yeah, I've had plenty of those.
Yeah, like that time I tried to fix a leaky faucet and ended up flooding my bathroom.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was a disaster, but looking back, it's kind of funny.
It's good to be able to laugh at yourself.
Yeah, totally. It just goes to show that even with the best intentions, things can go hilariously wrong.
That's life, right?
It is. So we haven't even talked about how the CARVER+Shock framework can be applied to a food supply chain.
We haven't.
And you mentioned those other case studies?
Yeah, the ones in the High Consequence Events Prevention Framework document.
Right. I think it would be really valuable to look at those.
Yeah, those real-world examples are so helpful.
Because they show how all these ideas play out in practice.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive into those case studies and see what we can learn.
That's good.
You know, we've been talking a lot about risk, and
Yeah.
it's kind of been framed as this negative thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's all about minimizing threats and staying safe.
Yeah, unwitting danger at all costs.
But what if we looked at it differently?
Okay.
What if instead of always trying to avoid risk,
Yeah,
we saw it as an opportunity?
that's interesting. I mean, risk is a part of everything we do.
Right? Driving a car, starting a business,
Mm-hmm.
even just trying a new recipe.
Yeah.
There's always some level of risk.
Right.
And if we're so focused on avoiding it,
Yeah.
we might miss out on some amazing opportunities.
That's true. Think about some of the biggest achievements in history.
Yeah.
Landing on the moon, developing vaccines.
Creating new technology.
Exactly. Those all involved taking huge risks.
But the potential payoff was so big that it was worth it.
Right. Sometimes you have to take a risk to get a reward.
Exactly.
So whether it's a personal goal or a new project at work,
Mm-hmm.
don't let the fear of failure hold you back.
Okay, I'm on board with embracing risk,
Good.
but how do we find that balance?
Yeah, how do you know which risks to take?
Exactly.
There's no easy answer, unfortunately.
Right.
It depends on your situation, how much risk you're comfortable with,
Right.
and the potential rewards.
But are there some questions we can ask ourselves to kind of help figure that out?
Yeah,
Not
definitely.
apply?
Well, one important question is, what happens if things go wrong?
Okay,
Can you handle the consequences?
right. Financially, emotionally,
Right.
reputationally.
All of that.
Okay, so you got to think about the downside.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, what are the potential rewards?
Right.
Are they big enough to make the risk worth taking?
So you got to weigh the costs and benefits.
You do. And it's also important to think about your own expertise.
Okay,
Are you ready to deal with the challenges that might come up?
right. So know your limits.
Exactly. Don't buy off more than you can chew.
Okay?
And even if you can't eliminate the risk completely,
Mm-hmm.
are there things you can do to minimize it?
So have a backup plan, a plan B.
Exactly. And remember, even if it doesn't work out, you can still learn from it.
Right. Failure is just part of the journey.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into risk awareness,
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to take risks.
I agree.
Step outside your comfort zone. Challenge yourself.
Yeah.
Embrace the unknown.
You might surprise yourself with what you can achieve.
Exactly. And even if you stumble, you'll learn and grow from it.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive.
It's been fun.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we hope you learned something new about risk awareness.
Yeah, keep exploring.
Stay curious and stay safe.